The Macedonian camp sprawled across the Cilician plain like a living creature, 20,000 campfires breathing smoke into the twilight sky. Alexander stood alone on a limestone outcrop overlooking the Gulf of Isis, watching the last crimson threads of sunlight dissolve into the Mediterranean. At 23, he commanded an army that had never known defeat, yet tonight his hands trembled, not from fear, but from the terrible electricity of anticipation that always preceded transformation. Behind him, the sound of his army preparing for tomorrow echoed across the valley, the rhythmic clang of bronze being sharpened, the low murmur of prayers to Ares and Athena, the crackling of fires that would burn through the night, because few men would sleep before facing the Great King of Persia. "You haven't eaten." The voice belonged to Hephaestion, who approached with the careful quietness of someone who had known Alexander since boyhood, who understood that sometimes the young king needed to be alone with his demons before he could face his destiny. Alexander didn't turn. "Darius has 150,000 men, perhaps 200,000. The scouts can't agree on the exact count." Numbers that large become meaningless. Hephaestion stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Aristotle used to say that." Alexander's lips curved into something between a smile and a grimace. "He also said I should turn back at the Hellespont, that Asia was too vast to conquer, that the Persian Empire had stood for 2 centuries and would stand for 2 centuries more. Aristotle never saw you lead a cavalry charge." Now Alexander did turn, and in the dying light his eyes held that peculiar intensity that made men willing to follow him into the underworld itself. Those eyes were mismatched, one blue as the Aegean, one green gold like a lion's, and they burned with a hunger that had nothing to do with food or sleep or ordinary human desires. "Tomorrow," Alexander said quietly, "either I die or I become legend." "Or both," Hephaestion replied with dark humor. "Your father would have liked those odds." The mention of Philip brought a shadow across Alexander's face. 3 years since an assassin's blade had ended the life of Macedon's greatest king, and still the wound felt fresh. Philip had dreamed of conquering Persia, but had died before crossing into Asia. Now his son stood on the edge of making that dream reality, or perishing in the attempt. Far to the north, beyond the narrow coastal plain where his army encamped, Alexander knew that Darius had positioned his forces. The Persian king had chosen the battlefield carefully, using the Pinarus River as a natural barrier and deploying his vast numbers to maximum advantage. It should have been perfect, a killing ground where the Macedonian phalanx would be crushed against superior numbers and annihilated. Should have been. But Alexander had studied every battle his father had ever fought, had absorbed every lesson Aristotle had taught about terrain and tactics and the psychology of warfare. And he had learned one truth above all others, that battles were not won by the largest army, but by the army that could adapt fastest to chaos. "Come," Hephaestion said, placing a hand on Alexander's shoulder. "Parmenion is waiting. We need to finalize the formations." Alexander nodded, casting one last look across the darkening water. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay Egypt, Babylon, the legendary cities of the East that existed in Greek imagination like golden myths. Tomorrow would determine whether those myths remained forever out of reach, or whether they would fall before Macedonian spears like grain before the scythe. In the command tent, the air was thick with olive oil smoke and the tension of men gambling everything on a single throw of fate's dice. Parmenion stood over a table scattered with clay models representing troop positions, his weathered face creased with concern. At 55, he was old enough to be Alexander's father, had served Philip with unwavering loyalty, and now served Philip's son with the same dedication, despite private reservations about the young king's recklessness. "The river crossing will be bloody," Parmenion said without preamble, as Alexander entered. "Darius has positioned his Greek mercenaries at the center, 15,000 hoplites who know exactly how to fight a phalanx. His cavalry wings number 40,000, and behind them," he gestured with the clay models with a scarred hand, "his personal guard, the Immortals, 10,000 of the finest warriors in the Persian Empire." "And Darius himself?" Alexander asked, moving to the table. "Center rear, in a chariot so heavily decorated,
It catches sunlight like a mirror. You could probably see it from here if you climbed high enough. Parmenian's tone carried a hint of disdain. Eastern opulence had always struck him as weakness disguised as splendor. Alexander studied the layout in silence, his mind calculating angles and possibilities with the speed of a mathematician solving an equation. His officers watched him, these men who had followed him across the Hellespont and through Anatolia, who had seen him fight at the front of every charge, who loved him and feared him in equal measure. "We'll refuse the left," Alexander said finally. "Parmenian, you'll command there. Hold the line, nothing more. Keep their cavalry engaged, but don't overcommit. The center will advance directly across the river, slow and steady. The phalanx must maintain formation, no matter what." "And you?" Parmenian already knew the answer and already hated it. Alexander's finger traced a line on the map, moving from the Macedonian right wing across the river and towards the Persian left. "The companion cavalry will cross at oblique angle, strike their left wing where it is weakest, then wheel inward towards Darius," Parmenian said, shook his head. "You're going to try to kill him yourself." "No." Alexander looked up, and his eyes held that terrible certainty that made older men question whether they were following a king or a god wearing human flesh. "I am going to succeed in killing him, or rather, in forcing him to flee. Once the great king runs, his army will collapse like a rope of sand." "It's madness," Parmenian said flatly. "You'll be cutting through the heart of his forces. If you're killed?" "If I'm killed, you'll retreat in good order and tell my mother I died well." Alexander's voice had gone cold. "But I won't be killed. Tomorrow, Parmenian, you're going to see something Aristotle never taught in any classroom. You're going to see how speed and violence of action can shatter an empire." The old general wanted to argue further, but something in Alexander's bearing stopped him. This was not the impulsive boy that had once been Philip's heir, always straining at his father's leash. This was something else entirely, something refined by 3 years of constant warfare into an instrument of pure will. "The men should sleep," Hephaestion interjected smoothly, reading the tension in the tent. "Tomorrow will be long." Alexander nodded. "Pass the word. Tell them that by sunset tomorrow, either we'll be dining in Darius's tent, or we'll be dining in Hades. Either way, it will be memorable." As the officers filed out to relay orders and make final preparations, Alexander remained at the table, staring at the clay models as if he could will them into motion through thought alone. Hephaestion lingered near the entrance, watching his friend in the flickering lamplight. "Do you remember what the oracle at Delphi told you?" Hephaestion asked quietly. Alexander smiled without humor. "The Pythia said I was invincible, but oracles are tricky things. They never specify the duration of invincibility. You could still withdraw, circle around, choose better ground." "And let Darius think I feared him?" Alexander shook his head. "No. Tomorrow we show the world that the age of Persian domination is over. Tomorrow we announce that something new has been born, something that will burn across Asia like wildfire." He spoke with such certainty that Hephaestion found himself believing, despite the odds, despite the impossible mathematics of 25,000 Macedonians facing 200,000 Persians. Alexander had that effect on people. He made the impossible seem inevitable, as if history itself bent to accommodate his will. "Get some rest," Hephaestion said finally. "You'll need it." But after he left, Alexander remained at the table for hours, studying the terrain, visualizing the battle in his mind, playing out every possible variation until he could see the victory like a memory of something that had already happened. This was his gift and his curse, the ability to imagine triumph so vividly that reality had no choice but to follow suit. Outside, the camp had grown quieter. Men slept fitfully, dreaming of home and honor and the terrible things they would do tomorrow in pursuit of both. The fires burned low. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the violence that dawn would bring. And in a tent much grander than Alexander's, on the far side of the Pinarus River, another king lay awake, contemplating the strange young Macedonian who had dared invade his empire and who now threatened to overturn an order that had stood since Cyrus the Great had first united Persia 2 centuries before.
Darius III of Persia had not been born to rule the world. He sat now in his pavilion, a structure so vast and ornate that it resembled a portable palace, surrounded by advisors who spoke in the honeyed tones of courtiers who had learned that telling an emperor uncomfortable truths was the fastest path to obscurity or worse. The walls were draped with tapestries depicting Cyrus's conquests, Xerxes' invasion of Greece, the glory of an empire that stretched from the Indus River to the shores of the Mediterranean. All of it felt increasingly like fiction. At 47, Darius was tall and physically imposing, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in military service before a series of palace intrigues and fortunate deaths had placed him on the throne 5 years earlier. He wore his dark beard oiled and curled in the Persian fashion, and his robes were purple silk so fine it seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. To look at him, one would see exactly what he wished them to see: the great king, the King of Kings, the shadow of the god Ahura Mazda made flesh. But Darius himself knew the truth. He was a caretaker emperor, elevated by the plotting of the eunuch Bagoas after the previous king and his legitimate heirs had been murdered. He had taken the throne not through conquest or divine right, but through survival and political necessity. And now, 3 years into his reign, a boy king from a minor kingdom on the edge of civilization threatened to expose the fundamental weakness at the heart of the Persian Empire, that it was held together not by strength, but by the collective agreement to pretend at strength. "Your Majesty," the voice belonged to Memnon, the Rhodian Greek who commanded Darius's mercenary forces. Unlike the Persian courtiers, Memnon had no interest in flattery. "We should consider withdrawing to the plains beyond the mountains. There we could fully deploy our cavalry, use our numerical advantage to withdraw." The interruption came from Arsames, satrap of Cilicia, and one of the Persian nobles who had engineered Darius's elevation. "The great king does not withdraw before a child barely old enough to grow a proper beard. We have 200,000 men. They have, what, 30,000 at most? Let them break themselves against our lines." Darius studied both men in silence. Memnon was right, tactically. The narrow coastal plain limited the effectiveness of superior numbers in cavalry. But Arsames was also right politically. To retreat without fighting would send a message of weakness that would reverberate throughout the empire. Satraps would begin calculating their chances of independence. Conquered peoples would start dreaming of rebellion. "Tell me about Alexander," Darius said finally. "Not what you think I want to hear. The truth." Memnon exhaled slowly. "He's brilliant, impulsive, certainly, but with an instinct for warfare that borders on prophetic. At the Granacus River, he led the cavalry charge personally, nearly died in the first minutes, and still shattered our defensive line through sheer audacity. At Miletus, he bypassed our naval superiority by capturing the ports and making our ships irrelevant. He's fast, aggressive, and willing to take risks that would make any sensible commander blanch." "So you're saying he's reckless?" "No, Your Majesty. I'm saying he's lucky. And in warfare, luck matters more than gold." Darius rose from his chair and walked to the entrance of his pavilion. Outside, his army sprawled across the plain like a vast carpet of humanity. Persians and Medes, Bactrians and Scythians, Greek mercenaries and Egyptian levies, every nation of his empire represented in a display of force that should have been overwhelming. Enough spears to block out the sun, as the old saying went. But as he watched his soldiers prepare for tomorrow, Darius felt a cold certainty settling in his chest. Numbers meant nothing if the men carrying the weapons didn't believe in the cause. And how many of these soldiers truly believed in Persia's invincibility? How many had heard the stories filtering out of Anatolia, of Macedonians fighting like demons, of a young king who seemed blessed by the gods themselves? "If Alexander breaks through tomorrow, if he reaches my position—" "He won't," Arsames said firmly. The Greek mercenaries will hold the center, our cavalry will crush his flanks, and if by some miracle he does penetrate our lines, you'll be surrounded by 10,000 immortals. Your majesty is as safe as if you stood in the heart of Persepolis itself." Darius nodded, but he was thinking of other things. He was thinking of his wife and children who traveled with the royal baggage train. He was thinking of the empire that stretched behind him, vast and wealthy and increasingly restless under Persian rule. He was thinking of all the ways this battle could go wrong and of the single narrow path to victory. "Double the guard around the royal family," he ordered, "and position my chariot where it can be clearly seen. If Alexander wants to make this personal, let him try. We'll show him what happens when a provincial boy king challenges the might of Persia." The advisors bowed and departed, leaving Darius alone with his thoughts. He moved to a table where wine waited in a golden cup, Persian vintage, sweet and strong. He drank deeply, welcoming the warmth that spread through his chest. Tomorrow would tell the tale. Either the Macedonian brat would die with a Persian spear through his heart, but no. Darius refused to consider the alternative. He was the great king. His empire was eternal. One upstart from the edges of the known world could not possibly overturn 2 centuries of Persian supremacy. Could he?
The false dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gray when Alexander's army began to move. There was no dramatic sunrise, no golden light breaking across the landscape like a scene from Homer. Just the cold, gradual brightening of a November morning and the sound of thousands of men preparing to kill or be killed. Alexander wore his armor, not the ceremonial golden panoply he used for state occasions, but the practical bronze cuirass that had saved his life at Granicus, dinted now in a dozen places, but still serviceable. His helmet bore a double white plume so his men could track his position in the chaos of battle. At his side hung the sword he claimed had been carried by Achilles himself, taken from the temple at Troy in a piece of theater that had delighted his soldiers and unnerved his enemies. He rode Bucephalus, the massive black war horse that had been his companion since boyhood. The animal sensed his rider's mood, prancing and tossing its head with barely contained energy. Together they were a striking image. The young king with his mismatched eyes and his legendary horse, both seemingly carved from the same fierce marble. "Formations are ready," Hephaestion reported, drawing alongside on his own mount. "Parmion signals he's in position on the left. The phalanx is assembled. The companion cavalry awaits your command." Alexander nodded, his eyes fixed on the Pinarus River that marked the boundary between here and eternity. Beyond it, the Persian army was already visible, a vast dark mass that seemed to cover the entire plain, banners snapping in the morning breeze, sunlight beginning to catch on bronze and gold. "Do you see it?" Alexander asked quietly. "See what?" "The gap between their cavalry and their center. It's slight, maybe 100 yards, but it's there. When we hit it at full gallop, it will widen. And once we're through, we'll be surrounded by 100,000 enemies," Hephaestion finished. Alexander grinned, and there was nothing civilized in that expression. It was the smile of a wolf sighting wounded prey. "Exactly. They'll have us right where we want them." He wheeled Bucephalus to face his assembled troops. The companion cavalry stood in perfect formation, 1,800 of Macedon's finest horsemen, nobles and warriors who had trained since childhood for moments exactly like this. Behind them, the phalanx bristled with sarissas, the 18-foot pikes that had revolutionized Greek warfare. These were not conscripts or slaves pressed into service. These were professional soldiers who had campaigned for 3 years without defeat, who believed their king was touched by divinity, who would follow him into the fire if he asked. "Sons of Macedon," Alexander's voice carried across the ranks,
trained by years of shouting orders in battle. Today, we face the Persian Empire, the greatest concentration of power the world has ever known. Their king sits behind those lines in a golden chariot, surrounded by his immortals, confident that his numbers will crush us like insects. A roar of defiance rose from the Macedonians. But numbers mean nothing without courage, without will, without the burning certainty that your cause is just and your gods are watching. Alexander drew his sword, the blade catching the strengthening light. We did not cross the Hellespont to fight cautiously. We did not march through Anatolia to hesitate now. We came to Asia to announce that a new age has dawned, an age when merit matters more than birth, when speed conquers mass, when a Greek can look a Persian in the eye and see not a master, but an equal to be measured in combat. The cheering grew louder, spreading through the ranks like fire through dry grass. Today, we will break the Persian center. We will drive through their lines like a spear through silk, and we will not stop until Darius himself flees before us, until every man in his army understands that the age of Persian invincibility died the moment we set foot on Asian soil. Alexander raised his sword above his head. "Are you with me?" The response was a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very earth. Thousands of voices united in a single word, "Yes." Then let's give them something to tell their grandchildren about. Alexander lowered his sword, pointing it across the river toward the Persian lines. Forward. The army moved.
The Panaris was not a wide river, but its banks were steep and its current swift enough to make crossing difficult while under fire. Alexander had planned for this. The phalanx would advance slowly, maintaining formation while the cavalry exploited the terrain's few fordable points. As the Macedonians approached the water, the Persian archers opened fire. The sky darkened with arrows. They fell like deadly rain, thousands of them, rattling off shields and armor with a sound like hailstones on bronze. Men screamed as shafts found gaps in their protection, as iron points punched through leather and flesh. The first casualties of the battle fell at the river's edge, their blood mixing with the cold mountain water. But the Macedonian phalanx did not falter. This was what they had trained for, advancing under fire, shields raised, maintaining the density of formation that made the Sarissa wall impenetrable. Step by measured step, the Macedonians entered the river, their officers shouting cadence to keep the line straight despite the current tugging at their legs. On the left wing, Parmenian's forces engaged the Persian cavalry in a grinding, brutal contest for control of the flank. Horses screamed and men died in the churning mess of combat that resulted when two mounted forces collided. All grace and tactics abandoned in favor of hacking at anything within reach until one side or the other broke. But on the right wing, Alexander had been waiting for his moment. "Now!" he roared, and the companion cavalry surged forward. They hit the river at a gallop, 1,800 horsemen in a wedge formation with Alexander at the very tip. Water exploded around them in huge plumes as they crashed through the shallows and charged up the far bank straight into the Persian left wing. The impact was catastrophic. Persian cavalry, caught in the process of repositioning, simply disintegrated under the Macedonian charge. The companions drove through them like a blade through water, scattering bodies and horses in their wake. Alexander fought at the front, his sword a blur of motion, his lion eyes fixed on a single point in the distance, the golden chariot where Darius stood, visible even through the chaos and dust of battle. Behind the cavalry, the phalanx had reached the Persian center. Here, the fighting became horrific. Greek mercenaries in Persian service fought Greek phalanxes in Macedonian service, both sides using identical tactics, both sides knowing exactly how to kill men trained in the same methods.
The river ran red. Bodies piled up at the fords, men slipped on their comrades' entrails and died before they could regain their footing. But the Macedonian phalanx was better disciplined. They advanced with machine-like precision, their sarissas finding gaps, their shield wall refusing to break no matter how many men fell. Inch by terrible inch, they began to push the Persian center back. Alexander didn't see any of this. His entire world had contracted to the wedge of horsemen around him and the narrowing distance between his position and Darius's chariot. A Persian noble on a magnificent white horse charged at him from the side. Alexander deflected the man's spear thrust and ran him through the throat in a single fluid motion. Another attacked from the left. Hephaestion intercepted him, their swords clashing in a brief exchange before the Persian fell with a scream. They were through the first line now, into the mass of the Persian army, and Alexander's gambit had worked. The gap between formations had widened under the pressure of his charge, creating a corridor of chaos through which the companions poured like water through a crack in a dam. "Darius!" Alexander's voice carried even over the sound of battle. And then, impossibly, their eyes met across 100 yards of carnage.
Darius saw him coming, the young Macedonian king astride his black horse, white plumes streaming, sword red to the hilt, cutting through Persian soldiers like a harvester through wheat. Around Alexander, his cavalry fought with the synchronized violence of men who had trained together since childhood, each protecting his neighbor's flank, the entire formation moving as a single organism toward the single most valuable target on the battlefield, toward Darius himself. "Protect the great king!" the cry went up from the immortals, and 10,000 of Persia's finest warriors moved to form a defensive wall between their emperor and the Macedonian madman. But they were too slow. Alexander had calculated everything perfectly. The angle of approach, the timing of the charge, the precise moment when the Persian formations would be too committed to other battles to reinforce their center. Now he exploited that calculation with the ruthless efficiency of a mathematician solving an equation in blood and bronze. A phalanx of immortals interposed themselves between the companions and Darius's chariot. Alexander didn't slow down. He crashed Bucephalus directly into their formation, the massive horse's weight and momentum shattering their line. Men went flying, spears snapped. Alexander's sword rose and fell with mechanical regularity, each stroke precise, economical, devastating. Hephaestion fought beside him, guarding his left flank. Behind them, the companions followed, their wedge formation driving deeper into the Persian center like a spear point aimed at a single vital organ. 50 yards. Darius could see Alexander's face now, could see the terrible focus in those mismatched eyes, blue and gold, storm and fire. This was not the face of a human being, but of something else, something that had shed its mortality and existed purely as an expression of will. Darius had seen battle madness before, had witnessed men consumed by bloodlust and fury. But this was different. Alexander fought with absolute clarity, every motion purposeful, his face a mask of concentrated intention. 30 yards. The immortals around Darius's chariot closed ranks, forming a bristling wall of spears. Persian nobles shouted challenges, trying to intercept the Macedonian king before he could reach their emperor. Alexander cut them down without apparent effort, as if they were training dummies rather than veteran warriors. 20 yards. And Darius understood, with the sudden clarity that comes in moments of absolute crisis, that Alexander was going to reach him, that all his numbers, all his wealth, all the might of the Persian Empire meant nothing in the face of this focused assault. The Macedonian had done the impossible. He had cut through 200,000 men to reach the empire's heart. "Your Majesty, we must withdraw." Memnon appeared at the chariot's side, his face spattered with blood.
If you're killed or captured, the empire falls, Darius finished quietly. 10 yards. Alexander raised his sword, and their eyes locked again, and in that instant Darius saw his own death approaching on a black horse, not necessarily today, but soon, inevitable, written in the stars from the moment this strange young Greek had crossed the Hellespont with dreams of conquest burning in his chest. The Great King of Persia made his choice. He said, "Drive," he commanded his charioteer, "away from the battle now." "Your Majesty," Arsamas's protest died as Darius turned to face him. "I said now, or we all die here, and Persia dies with us." The charioteer cracked his whip, the horses surged forward, and the golden chariot, the symbol of Persian might, the mobile throne from which Darius had planned to watch his enemies destroyed, began to flee the battlefield.
The moment Darius's chariot turned, the battle ended. Not immediately. Individual combats continued. Men still fought and died in a dozen separate melees across the plain, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. When the Persian soldiers saw their emperor fleeing, when they witnessed the great king abandoning the field, something fundamental broke in their collective will. It began with the immortals closest to the chariot. These men, who had sworn oaths to die protecting their emperor, found themselves suddenly purposeless. They hesitated, their formation wavering, and in that moment of uncertainty, Alexander's cavalry cut through them like a hot knife through wax. Then the panic spread. The Persian cavalry on both wings, seeing the center collapse, began streaming to the rear. The Greek mercenaries fought on for a few more minutes, their professionalism and discipline holding the line, even as everything around them dissolved into chaos. But eventually even they recognized the futility of continuing and began an organized withdrawal, their shields locked together as they backed toward the mountains. Alexander could have pursued Darius. Every instinct screamed at him to chase the fleeing emperor, to run him down and end the Persian Empire with a single stroke. But he had learned enough from Parmenion to recognize that battles had rhythms, that there were moments when aggression served and moments when consolidation was wiser. "Let him run," Alexander commanded, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "But take the camp. Take everything." The Macedonians swept through the Persian encampment like locusts through a wheat field. They found wealth beyond imagination, gold and silver, precious gems, artwork worth kingdoms, the accumulated treasure of an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to India. They found Persian nobles cowering in their tents. They found slaves and servants and camp followers numbering in the tens of thousands. And they found Darius's family. The royal pavilion was a structure of such opulence that it made Alexander's entire camp look like a collection of shepherds' huts. Inside, surrounded by terrified attendants, sat the great king's mother, his wife, and his 2 young daughters. Statara, Darius's wife, was perhaps the most beautiful woman Alexander had ever seen, dark-eyed and graceful, holding her daughters close as Macedonian soldiers burst into the tent. "No one touches them," Alexander commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "These are royalty. They will be treated with the respect due their station." He approached slowly, still covered in blood and grime from the battle, conscious of how he must appear, like a demon from Greek mythology, dripping gore and violence. He stopped a respectful distance away and removed his helmet. "I am Alexander of Macedon. Your husband and son live. They escaped the battlefield. You are now under my protection." Sisygambis, Darius's elderly mother, studied him with sharp eyes that had witnessed 60 years of palace intrigue and imperial politics. "You are very young to have shattered an empire." "I haven't shattered it yet. I've merely introduced myself." Despite everything, the terror, the uncertainty, the knowledge that her world had just been overturned, Sisygambis almost smiled.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The sun set on a transformed world. The battlefield was a charnel house, 30,000 Persian dead against fewer than 500 Macedonian casualties. The disparity spoke to the totality of Alexander's victory, to the devastating effectiveness of his tactics. But beyond the mere mathematics of death lay something more significant: the psychological fracture of Persian invincibility. In his captured tent, now Alexander's tent, the young king sat with his officers, sharing wine from golden Persian cups. His armor lay in a corner, being cleaned by attendants. His body ached from a dozen minor wounds, none serious, but all throbbing in symphony. He felt hollowed out, the battle fury that had sustained him replaced by a bone-deep weariness. Darius escaped, Parmenion said, his tone making it unclear whether this was statement or accusation. Darius fled, Alexander corrected. There's a difference. An escape implies dignity. He abandoned his army, his family, his empire's treasury, and ran like a rabbit before a wolf pack. But he lives, which means the war continues. Alexander swirled the wine in his cup, watching the liquid catch the lamplight. Let him live. Let him sit in Babylon or Persepolis or wherever he's running to and contemplate what happened today. Let every satrap in the empire hear the story of how the great king fled before a Macedonian cavalry charge. Let them ask themselves whether Darius is worth dying for. Hephaestion, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, finally spoke. You're going to offer terms. Generous terms. I'll send a message tomorrow. He can keep his title, his wealth, all east of the Euphrates. All I want is the Mediterranean coast, Egypt, and formal recognition that we are equals, not subject and emperor, but kings negotiating as peers. He'll refuse, Parmenion predicted. Probably, Alexander agreed. Pride is expensive. That I'll make the offer anyway, because when I do eventually march into Persepolis, I want everyone to know that I gave him every chance for peace. I want history to record that I was reasonable. Reasonable? Parmenion's laugh was bitter. You just gambled your entire army on a cavalry charge that should have gotten you killed. You're many things, Alexander, but reasonable isn't one of them. Alexander didn't argue. Instead, he rose and walked to the tent's entrance, looking out over the camp where his soldiers celebrated their impossible victory. Fires burned bright in the darkness. Songs rose up, rough soldier songs about glory and slaughter, and the strange young king who led them to triumph against all odds. Do you know what I learned today? Alexander asked quietly. I learned that my father was right about one thing, that warfare is ultimately about will, not numbers. Whoever believes in victory most completely will usually achieve it. Darius had every advantage except one. He didn't truly believe he would win. Somewhere deep in his heart, he feared me, and that fear made him vulnerable. And you? Hephaestion joined him at the entrance. Do you ever fear? Alexander considered the question seriously. Every morning, every night. But not during battles. During battles, fear is a luxury I can't afford. So I lock it away, and by the time I remember to feel afraid, the fighting is already over. They stood in comfortable silence. Two young men who had gambled everything and won, contemplating the vast future that now opened before them like an unexplored ocean. Darius's mother called you son today, when you visited her pavilion after the battle. She said you reminded her of what Darius could have been if he'd been born differently. She's kind, perceptive, but kind. Will you marry one of the daughters? Perhaps, if it serves the greater purpose. But that's a problem for the future Alexander. The present Alexander is too tired to think about matrimony.
3 days after the battle, in a palace in distant Babylon, Darius received 2 pieces of correspondence. The first was a report from the survivors of Issus, confirming what he already knew, that his army had been destroyed, his family captured, his treasury seized, that he had fled the field and in doing so had forfeited any claim to the empire's loyalty. Already word came of satraps withholding tribute, of provinces declaring independence, of the centrifugal forces that the Persian Empire had barely held in check for 2 centuries, suddenly tearing the whole structure apart. The second was a letter from Alexander. It was written in Greek, but accompanied by a Persian translation, and it began with a formal greeting between equals. Alexander, king of Macedon, to Darius, king of Persia. The terms were exactly as Alexander had outlined to his officers. Keep everything east of the Euphrates, maintain his title and wealth, accept peace between 2 great kingdoms rather than continue a war that could only end in further Persian defeats. It was generous, almost insultingly so. Darius read it 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of calculated diplomacy and veiled threat. The message was clear. Alexander didn't need to conquer all of Persia to destroy it. He merely needed to keep winning battles until the empire collapsed from its own internal contradictions. "What will you tell him?" Memnon asked. The Greek mercenary commander had survived Issus and made his way to Babylon, though many of his men had not been so fortunate. Darius set down the letter. His hands, he noticed, were completely steady. That surprised him. He had expected them to shake. Perhaps he had finally moved beyond fear into some new territory where emotion no longer reached. "I will tell him that Persia does not negotiate with invaders," Darius said quietly. "That the empire has withstood challenges before and will withstand this one. That his victories are temporary, that his supply lines are overextended, that winter approaches and with it his doom. All of which is propaganda, Your Majesty. We both know the truth. Which is that you should accept his terms while you still have a kingdom left to rule." Darius stood and walked to the palace window. Below, Babylon sprawled in all its ancient glory. Gardens and temples, palaces and streets, the accumulated civilization of centuries. Somewhere in this city was the tomb of Alexander the Great's hero, Cyrus, the founder of the empire. Somewhere in these streets walked descendants of the warriors who had conquered half the known world. And somewhere, marching closer with each passing day, came the young Macedonian who seemed determined to prove that all of it, the history, the glory, the imperial myth, was nothing but sand castles waiting for the tide. "Send my reply," Darius commanded. "Refuse his terms. Tell him that Persia bows to no foreign king, that we will fight to the last man before we surrender our sovereignty." "Your Majesty." "I know it's foolish," Darius interrupted. "I know he'll crush whatever army I raise, that he'll march through my empire like a force of nature until there's nothing left but ruins and memories. But I am the Great King of Persia, and I will not be remembered as the man who gave away the empire without fighting to preserve it." He turned from the window, and for a moment Memnon saw in Darius's eyes something that hadn't been there at Issus. Not fear or uncertainty, but a kind of terrible resolve. The resolve of a man who had accepted his fate and chosen to face it with whatever dignity remained. "Besides," Darius added with a thin smile, "who's to say Alexander will stop at the Euphrates even if I do accept? Men like him don't know when to stop conquering. They measure themselves against legends and find
mortality insufficient. Better to fight and lose gloriously than to surrender and die by inches. The reply was sent. Alexander received it 2 weeks later, while marching south along the Mediterranean coast towards Egypt. He read it once, smiled grimly, and tucked it into his baggage. "Well?" Alexander asked. He refused, as expected. Alexander mounted Bucephalus and gestured for the army to resume marching. "Then we continue east, into Mesopotamia, into Persia itself if necessary. We'll give him one more chance to surrender before the next battle. And if he refuses again, you'll take everything." "No," Alexander corrected quietly. "I'll take what's freely given by soldiers tired of dying for a king who runs from battles. The empire won't fall to me, Hephaestion. It will fall to its own weight. I'm just helping it along."
History would remember Issus as the battle that broke Persia's spirit, though the empire would stumble on for another 2 years before final collapse. Darius would meet Alexander twice more on the battlefield, at Gaugamela, where an even larger Persian army would be destroyed with even greater efficiency, and at the gates of Ecbatana, where the great king would die not in combat, but at the hands of his own courtiers who hoped to curry favor with their new master. Alexander would mourn him, oddly enough, would give Darius a royal funeral and claim to avenge him by hunting down the conspirators, would marry his daughter Statara in a mass wedding designed to unite Greek and Persian bloodlines, would try in his own way to reserve something of the empire he had conquered. But on that November evening in 333 BCE, as Alexander's army celebrated their impossible victory at Issus, none of this had yet happened. The future remained unwritten, full of possibility and peril in equal measure. Alexander stood once more at the edge of his camp, looking not west toward Macedon and the home he would never see again, but east, toward the vast unexplored territories that called to him like sirens to ancient sailors. Beyond the horizon lay Babylon and Persepolis, the Hindu Kush and the Indus River, deserts and mountains and civilizations whose names existed in Greek consciousness as little more than rumors. "What are you thinking?" Hephaestion joined him, as he always did during these moments of quiet contemplation. "I'm thinking that Aristotle once told me that a man should know his limits, that hubris was the greatest sin, that reaching beyond one's grasp led to destruction. And I've decided Aristotle was wrong." Alexander's voice held a strange mix of wonder and determination. "I don't think we have limits, not real ones. I think we have fears pretending to be wisdom, caution masquerading as virtue. Today we proved that 30,000 men with enough courage and belief can defeat 200,000. If that's possible, what else becomes possible? What other supposed limits are just illusions waiting to be shattered? You're talking about more than military victories. I'm talking about everything." Alexander gestured at the darkness beyond their fires, at the infinite unknown that represented both threat and promise, about showing the world that birth doesn't determine worth, that a Greek can rule Persia as well as any Persian, that all the ancient hierarchies and assumed superiorities are just stories we tell ourselves. "I'm going to march east, Hephaestion, as far as the world extends, and everywhere I go, I'm going to leave behind this idea that human potential is unlimited, that we can become anything we dare to imagine." "Or die trying." "Or die trying," Alexander agreed. "But at least we'll die reaching for something magnificent rather than settling for comfortable mediocrity." They stood together in the darkness, two young men who had glimpsed something beyond the ordinary boundaries of human experience, the possibility that will and courage and brilliant action could reshape the world itself. Behind them, the fires of the Macedonian camp burned bright. Before them, the road to Babylon beckoned. And in that moment, standing on the edge of everything, Alexander felt the fear he had locked away during the battle finally resurface. Not fear of death or defeat, but fear of a stranger's sword, fear that he might actually achieve everything he dreamed of, might conquer the known world and reach its furthest edges, only to find that the horizon kept receding, that there would always be one more mountain to cross, one more river to ford, one more empire to humble, that he might discover too late that men like him could never be satisfied,
that the hunger driving him forward would consume him long before old age ever could. But that was a worry for the future Alexander. The present Alexander had an empire to conquer and a legend to build. So he turned from the darkness, smiled at his friend, and walked back toward the light and warmth of his army's fires, where songs were being sung about the Lionite king who had made the impossible seem inevitable. Behind him, the darkness waited. But ahead, the whole world burned with possibility. The Battle of Issus would be remembered for millennia as the moment when East met West in decisive combat, when a young Macedonian king proved that speed and will could triumph over numbers and tradition. It marked the true beginning of Alexander's conquest of Persia, the point at which destiny moved from possibility to inevitability. Darius III would never fully recover from the psychological blow of fleeing from Issus. His army would grow larger, his preparations more thorough, but the shadow of that November day would haunt him until his death. He had blinked first in the contest of wills, and in ancient warfare, such hesitations were rarely forgiven. Alexander would go on to become Alexander the Great, would march to the ends of the known world, would die at 32, having conquered more territory than any human being in history. But it all began here, on a narrow coastal plain where a young king gambled everything on a single cavalry charge and won not just a battle, but the keys to an empire. The age of Persian dominance ended at Issus. The age of Alexander, the age of fire and transformation and unrealized human potential, was just beginning.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.